So remember, as we start in Job 34, this is the final responses to Job from Job's friends. Remember, the first three friends were the older friends who gave their wisdom, which wasn't much of wisdom. And then Elihu has been sitting and watching for however long it was, days or weeks or hours. And he's the young man who is respectful and doesn't speak, but then at the end he is speaking. Remember, we talked about last week when the writer introduces Elihu, the word anger was repeated several times. He's angry at Job because he sees Job as being self-righteous. And what we looked at last week in chapter 33 and 32 was that Elihu is just to summarize him, he is very verbose. He speaks a lot and claims to have all this wisdom, and people should listen to him, but he never gives a reason why you should listen to him. He never gives a reason. He just keeps talking, and he is not giving any new information, any new ethics, or any new theology. So we're going to look at his second and third speech, then we'll summarize it, and then we'll have some time to discuss and talk. So Job 34 is his second speech. And the focus here, if you're looking at the theme of 34, it is the justice of God, defending the justice of God, which Job already believes. Remember that? Job does not attack the justice of God. He just wants answers. And so Elihu defends the justice of God, which no one's attacking, and then repeatedly appeals to wise men to defend his views. So if you were outlining Job 34, verses 2 through 9, this young guy Elihu attacks Job's piety towards God. That's his first way to defend God, is to attack Job. And then in verses 10 through 30, Elihu defends the justice of God. And then verses 31 through 37, Elihu attacks Job's piety towards God. So that's, again, an envelope structure, a chiastic structure, an inclusio structure, where the first and the last are the same. The middle is the focus of the text, which is verses 10 through 30, defending God's justice. That's the center of the text. So if we look at chapter 34, really Elihu is trying to score debate points. He's not really trying to help Job. That's really the tone of it. He asserts that God cannot be questioned in his ways. He actually, verse 3 of chapter 34 is a quote of Job. He's quoting Job, 34 verse 3, he says, "Hear my words, you wise men, give ear to me, you who know, for the ear tests words as the palate tastes food." That is a reference back to Job chapter 12. So he's quoting Job. In verses 5 through 6, Elihu goes too far by asserting that Job has accused God of calling him a liar. Okay, a quick little question. Has Job accused God of being a liar? No, he hasn't. So that's what you'd call an ad hominem attack, an attack on the person. So Elihu, you can see in chapter 34, he's disingenuous. He's attacking the person. What's Job's primary complaint at this point? It's been that God has been silent. It's not that God is dishonest or unjust. It's that, hey, you've killed off my family, you've taken all my money, you've given me boils and all that stuff, and yet you're nowhere to be found. That's his complaint. So again, Elihu is not arguing on good terms here. In verses 10 through 15, Elihu proudly proclaims that God can do no wrong. And he bases this on the fact that God is the creator, God maintains all things, he gives to each person what they deserve. That's not something, the last point they've been debating, but the fact that God is creator of all things and maintains all things, has Job argued that? No, Job has not argued that. So again, Elihu is not really engaging actually in the argument. He's just trying to score debate points. That's what it seems like. So Elihu in verses 17 through 30, his general idea is, if political leaders, monarchs cannot be questioned for their actions, how can you question the creator of the universe? And Elihu makes the point that God brings judgment without warning and without trial because he does not need to consider the opinions of man. That's what Elihu is trying to say. And then he concludes his second speech to Job in verses 31 through 37 with some comments on suffering. And his conclusion is this, and it's not exactly a news flash. His conclusion is Job is to blame for his suffering, which is what the other three friends have ultimately come around to. So has Elihu given any new information? No, the answer is no. He's not given any new information. The person to blame is Job. And again, Job, as we've seen for many chapters, has said, show me the sin and I'll repent. And we went through all those sins last week where he says, I've not treated the poor badly. I've been faithful to my wife. I've done all these things correctly. Also here at the end of chapter 34, Elihu says that Job has rebelled against God. That's really the tone there. What's missing is, before we go to the last speech, the one final comment, as you read chapter 34, as you read Elihu, is there any notion of God forgiving Job for his sin? Is there any notion of atonement, of forgiveness, of mercy? There isn't. You read it, you look for it. Elihu does not have, just like the other three friends, the older friends, he does not have an idea of a God who would actually forgive you for screwing up. It is, okay, Brian screwed up or Roger screwed up. You get thunderbolts and lightning and wrath, judgment. That's all that you get. There's no idea of God giving mercy.
What was your question?
Does Elihu have any understanding of God demonstrating mercy towards sinners? And the answer is clearly no. So we'll go to his third speech, chapter 35. This is the final speech, and it really just deals with two questions. So chapter 35 deals with two questions. Verses 2 through 8. Why should an individual live right before God? That's the question. Why should you live an ethical, moral life? And then in verses 9 through 16 is the second one, which is, why doesn't God answer prayer? So why should you live right before God? And why doesn't God answer prayer? And his answer to the first question about why you should live right before God centers on the greatness of God. That's his idea. And he's really quoting Job and the other friends. So if you look at verse 5 of chapter 35, it's really a reference back to Job chapter 9, verses 8 through 10. He's referencing Job. If you looked at verse 6, 6 is a reference back to Job chapter 7, verse 20. If you looked at verse 7, it's a reference back to Job chapter 22, verse 3. So Job my point here is he's referencing old material. Job has not disagreed with his friends on this point, and Elihu has not added anything new or substantive to the conversation, to the discussion about why Job is suffering and his response and God's response. So Elihu has a view of God that is quite unaffected by human wickedness on the one hand and human righteousness. God just does this. A plus B always equals C. And so God always acts the same way. He has a God in a box. The answer to the second question on prayer, the second question again was, why doesn't God answer prayer? Is found in verses 9 through 16. And according to Elihu, people disqualify themselves in prayer because of their own sin, their own shortcomings, their own failings. And so the idea of Job has oppressed others because Job is wealthy. He's oppressed others. That's prevented him from prayer. Job's been proud because he's so wealthy and successful that's prevented God from answering his prayer. But if you think about that theologically, if that were the case, what prayers would God answer? Would he answer your prayers?
Well, he does. It's just in his time and not our time.
Yeah, we'll save that for discussion.
Maybe it's no.
Yeah,
You know,
we'll save that for discussion. The straightforward answer is no, he would not if it was based just on your actions. And we'll come back to that and we'll discuss it. I don't want to cut you off there. I want to make sure we gain some traction here and get through Job. For Elihu, if Brian sins or Libba sins or whoever sins, then God will not answer your prayer. And it's always that case. And if that is the qualifications for answered prayer, you would never have your prayers answered. So again, the New Testament will shed light on this. So we're not bringing the New Testament in just yet. We will. Because our prayers are answered because of someone who is our mediator. And we're going to talk about that in about 4 minutes. We do have a mediator, which is referenced to in Job 32. So we'll finish up here. Job chapter 34. Let me find my place here. Elihu's final words are two sections, Job chapter 36 and 37. The themes here of his final speech are judgment for the wicked, not a novel idea, and second of all, the greatness of God. Judgment for the wicked and the greatness of God. And these are themes, again, remember when you read the Bible, it is not just a container of theological points. You've probably figured that out. It also is a literary work. And so the themes in chapter 36 and 37 are going to lead the reader or the listener in the original audience towards God's speeches about what God does with the wicked, but also the greatness of God. So 36 and 37 are the final words of Elihu, but they are also the transition to what God will say. So it's leading the reader or the listener in the original audience to God's words in chapters 38 and following. So let's go quickly over chapter 36 so we have enough time to discuss some of the things that we've been talking about. In chapter 36, Elihu says, Job, be patient with him. Elihu believes that God is not with Job. So Elihu is going to bring knowledge to Job from God. Very, very thoughtful of him. In verses 5 through 12, Elihu asserts that God brings trouble in order to test people and to discipline them, which contradicts what Job has asserted, which is that Job has said sometimes the wicked actually enjoy a long life and blessing. Sometimes the worst leaders are blessed from our perspective. And you could think about the story of Joseph in Genesis. Sometimes, Joseph is imprisoned, enslaved for over a decade. Did Joseph deserve that? Probably not. Just to be fair, probably not. And Elihu says the life of the wicked person ends in shame. And in chapter 36, which the Hebrew word there, just to give you, when we read the English, it's often a little bit more tame and subdued. The English word there for him saying that your life will end in shame is actually the Hebrew word that you would translate as a male prostitute. So he's not, if he was saying that about someone, I pick on Gary, and calling him that name, it's not a compliment, right? It's not a compliment. He is trying to slap him in the face verbally. So when we say you're going to end in shame, it is a specific imagery of shame that he is bringing to mind. In verse 15, a summary statement is, quote, he delivers the afflicted by their affliction and opens their ear by adversity. That's kind of his summary statement. And then in the next few verses, he accuses Job of sin, warns him of the dangers of sin, and urges Job again to turn from sin. So again, Elihu has not added anything new. It's basically, Job, you're a sinner, turn from sin, and God will respond. The second aspect of Elihu's speech is devoted to the splendor of God and his creation, specifically the thunderstorm in verses 26 through 33. Elihu says that we cannot understand or imitate God's work in the thunderstorm. He says there, Elihu does, God or he covers his hands with the lightning. And that's using some kind of pagan account of storm gods that would throw down lightning bolts. So that's kind of the imagery of the culture, which again is very ancient. Again, I would argue that Job is probably written before the monarchy, which is around 1000 BC. And again, if you look at some of that storm imagery is also used in the Psalms. So you compare Psalm 29 is a theophany of God in the storm. Psalm 29. So we'll wrap up here. Elihu continues his account of God's work in the storm in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 37. And then he transitions to snow and ice in verses 6 through 13. God does that. Again, these are words to prepare you for God's speeches, which he does talk about storms and snow and all that kind of stuff. So it's literary. The literary perspective is it's preparing you for what God is going to say. Verses 14 through 20, he begins a litany of questions towards Job to kind of put Job on his heels. And the speech ends on a note of awesome tranquility. The storm is abated. There are streams through the clouds, streams of light through the clouds. And he says in verse 24, though men fear him, he does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. And this again brings us back to Job's statement in Job 28, his summary statement on wisdom. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. So very similar ideas, but coming from a different perspective. So a couple summary points on what we've seen with Elihu, and then we'll have some time to discuss. And these are more, when I do summary points, they're more redemptive historical. So trying to place this in the context of Scripture. So first, what we said earlier, Elihu does not have a view of God that emphasizes forgiveness of sins. So Elihu is very similar to Bildad and Zophar, who we saw earlier. He doesn't have an idea of a God who would forgive you when you fall short of his standard, to use Romans 3. He doesn't have an idea. God always punishes the wicked, and that's the standard. In Job chapter 33, I'm going to read a couple verses. Job chapter 33, verses 22 through 28. Job 33, 22 through 28. He's talking about the plight of Job and the plight of suffering. He says, his soul draws near the pit and his life to those who bring death. If there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the 1,000 to declare to man what is right for him. And he is merciful to him and says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then man prays to God and he accepts him. He sees his face with a shout of joy. He restores to man his righteousness. He sings before men and says, quote, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not repaid to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down into the pit, and my life shall look upon the light. So the theme here, specifically in verse 23, if there be for him an angel, that's the Hebrew word messenger, a mediator, one of 1,000. So the idea there is that Job needs a mediator, someone between him and God. That's fulfilled in the New Testament. And that one of 1,000 really could be translated or seen as, this is from Walter Kaiser, former Gordon Conwell president, Old Testament scholar. He says that could be seen as one who soars above the thousands and has no equal. So someone who is better than others, basically, who can do what other people cannot do. Job needs a mediator who will deliver Job from going down to the pit, Sheol, the place of the dead, the container place where the dead go. Old Testament eschatology there. Who will mediate between God and the suffering person? And again, what does that bring to mind? That brings to mind you need a mediator. You need someone between you and God. That is the work of Christ. He is the divine mediator who does that. He is the one who condescends and comes down from above to reconcile us and to deliver folks, deliver sinners from a destiny of death. So if you look at verse 24, the divine mediator pays a ransom for the afflicted. It says he is merciful to him and says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Does that bring to, we were talking about this, Gary, specifically in the patristic church, the ransom theory of the atonement of Jesus Christ, which is part of it. It's an aspect of atonement that Jesus Christ pays a ransom, but he doesn't pay it, contra the patristic church, Ignatius Irenaeus. He doesn't pay it to the devil, like we were talking about. He pays the ransom that we owe to God. He pays it himself. So think of 1 Timothy 2:6. Jesus Christ gave himself as a ransom. That's where ransom theology comes from. 1 Timothy 2:6. Jesus Christ gave himself as a ransom for all, which is the testimony given at the proper time. And Paul says, I was appointed a preacher and apostle. I'm telling the truth, Paul says, I'm not lying, a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. Matthew chapter 20, Christ says, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. And how does that statement end? And to give his life as a ransom for many. Revelation. And did that click off? Okay, I think we got a battery going out. Revelation 5:9. We'll change that here in a few minutes. Revelation 5:9 says, they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, have made them a kingdom and priests to our God. So again, you see foreshadowing a theology that will be filled in the New Testament, in Matthew and in Timothy and in Revelation. And the mediator will redeem the afflicted one. So if you look back at Job chapter 33, verse 30, 33 verse 30 says, this mediator will bring his soul from the pit that he may be lighted with the light of life. That should bring to mind the work of Christ. The mediator brings the light of life. What does John chapter 8 say? Verse 12 specifically, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me does not walk in darkness, but has the light of life. Christ fulfills that role of the mediator. And then finally, we'll have some discussion before the battery goes out. In Job, you see the afflicted are how do they relate to their sufferings? In the New Testament, we know that the afflicted, which is us, everyone, sin, guilt, are not delivered by what you suffer. Whatever God brings into your life, what he decrees, to use Westminster language, whatever he decrees that is seen from us as suffering, does not deliver you from anything that you've done wrong. Christ takes that on himself. That is penal substitution atonement theory. That Christ takes on the penalty, and he is the substitute, so that You don't have to go, or I don't have to go to a cross or to an execution chamber to give up my life for my sin. So Job 36, verse 15, he delivers the afflicted by their affliction. He opens their ear by adversity. So Elihu has asserted that God will use affliction and suffering to deliver the afflicted. But really we know that you cannot pay God enough to deliver yourself from your sin. I mean, that is Reformed theology, that is biblical theology, that is Pauline theology, Augustinian, that no matter what sins you avoid, and whatever goodness you have in your life, and if you try to bring that in and offer that to God and say, is this enough? It is not enough. He has to do it for you, and He's chosen to do it for you, because you would not choose to do it even if you could do it. That's called total depravity. It's called the doctrines of grace. Isaiah 53:5, Christ was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon Him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by His stripes, or with His stripes, we are healed. The Lord, Isaiah, and again, this is 700 years before Christ. The Lord has laid on Him the iniquity of us all. Your sufferings are used, Romans 8, to sanctify you. And I don't say that lightly. No one wants to suffer. Christ's suffering is for your redemption. That's what you see foreshadowed in Job. They're trying to figure out, how does your suffering deal with your sin? Christ is the one that deals with that.